Welcome back to Gameball. I'm your host, Matt Simontia, and you're listening on WSBF FM Clemson. Joining the show, we have an incredible guest. He is a reporter covering the Jets and the Giants for Sportsnet New York, Conor Hughes. Conor, thank you for joining us. How's your day going?
It's going well, buddy. How are you, man?
Pretty good. And, you know, people follow the sports world, whether they're in New York or not, they know a lot is occurring with the Giants and the Jets. I mean, a lot of crazy situations, starting with the Jets. They just named that former GM Mike Tannenbaum and Rick Spielman will be leading the charge in trying to find a new GM and a new head coach for the team next season. Just in your mind, like, what do you think of this approach, bringing in a former GM of the New York Jets? I feel like that's never really been done before, where they bring in a GM that was fired by the team.
Yeah, actually, I was talking about that last night on SNY, that it's been kind of a crazy week or so here between the Daniel Jones, the Joe Douglas firing, all that other stuff, Daniel Jones release, that I haven't had a chance to dive into the history books. But I don't necessarily know if there is a single example across any sporting league where a fired executive comes back several years later and then helps the team find the position that he was fired from. I mean, it is pretty wild. But the one thing about the Jets and Woody Johnson is that Johnson knows what he doesn't know. And he's not Robert Kraft. He is not John Mara. He's not a born and raised, up-in-the-world football guy in terms of, you know, he understands the makings of the team in that regard. So what he has done before, and this isn't the first time, is that he's hired firms or football lifers to help him fill these positions. Because when it comes to a head coach, you can talk to the right guys and have a general idea of you know, who's going to be out there. But executives are a little bit harder. So this is unorthodox in terms of it being Mike Tannenbaum, but it's certainly something Woody's done before in terms of just going out there, finding football people to help him find other football people. Granted, it hasn't worked all that well in the past.
Yeah, well, we'll see what happens. I mean, Rick Spielman, the other person man in the front, did a great job with the Commanders, helping find Dan Quinn and their new GM. Do you think the success of what Washington's doing helped propel Woody Johnson to even further want to bring in a guy like Spielman?
I'm sure it certainly played a role, I'm sure. But I think one thing to remember about Washington, and this is not to take away anything from their front office or take anything away from Dan Quinn, who honestly has been pretty impressive to this point. I think a lot of what they have done thus far in terms of the success they've had on the field is who they drafted second overall in Jaden Daniels.
Yeah.
So that is the major part of that. I mean, if you take someone of a caliber of quarterback of what Jaden Daniels has been so early in his career, and you throw him on any team, that team is going to improve, and that team is going to get better. And I mean, imagine if, you know, they had gone with someone else, and I know Drake May honestly looks pretty good too, but, you know, if they had gone with a Zach Wilson player or they had gone with a Justin Fields level player at that position, I think the Commanders got pretty damn lucky that it looks like there might have been three, potentially four if you loop in Bo Nix, and we don't even know what J.J. McCarthy is yet, franchise quarterbacks in this year's draft, and they might have gotten the best of the bunch. So that plays a pretty big role as much as who's calling the shots. Because, again, this isn't like the Commanders were drafting number one overall and their GM dug his feet in the ground and said, you know what, we're taking Jaden Daniels even though everyone thinks we should go Caleb. Once Caleb went one, the consensus number two pick has been Jaden Daniels for a while, and it just panned out that way that he's a pretty good football player.
Yeah, I mean, luck of the draw, but still, you know, tremendous effort by Washington. Speaking about the quarterback position, though, Aaron Rodgers, it seems like there's a lot of conflicting reports coming out about him potentially skipping injury scans because he wants to finish the year out not on the IR like he did last year. Others saying he's fine. Like, what do you know about the Aaron Rodgers situation and what his future looks like?
Yeah, I can't speak to him skipping scans or anything like that, but I can tell you the guy's banged up. I mean, that's something that is very well documented. He's dealing with 2 knee injuries. He's dealing with a hamstring issue. He's dealing with an ankle issue. I mean, it's basically, you know, we're approaching Christmas season, so the old Christmas vacation line about, you know, Audrey will talk later. She's frozen from like the neck down or whatever.
Yeah.
It's basically that. I mean, he's hurt from the waist down. Like he is banged up, and that's one of the reasons why you've seen some of his mobility issues throughout the pocket. And unfortunately, I don't know if that's a surgery fix. I don't know if that's just you need a whole off-season fix. I'm not terribly sure. But usually when you start dealing with issues at 40, they don't suddenly get better at 41, 42, 43 years old. So I think this just might be an example of Father Time throwing some blows at Aaron Rodgers that he hasn't been able to fight off just yet.
Yeah, and speaking about, again, the Aaron Rodgers situation where it's just time's catching up with him, and obviously they're already assembling a new searching team for a GM and a coach. Just from the outside looking in, like, what's your sense of this locker room where they had these sky high expectations to want to contend for a championship, right, entering this year, and now they're 3-8 coming off a bye. I mean, what's this locker room feeling like right now?
Well, that's the crazy thing is that with the news breaking this week that the Jets have hired a firm to go find a new GM, to find a new head coach, it's basically the ownership and management admitting that they're punting on this season, that the season's, or not punting on this season, but that the season's over, that they know they're not accomplishing anything this year. There's no one on the coaching staff that's fighting for their job. It's not like if Jeff Ulbrich has a nice run here, he's going to be the team's head coach. I mean, they are going to have a new head coach and a general manager next year, which means a brand new viewpoint on the roster and a brand new technical viewpoint on the roster in terms of the schemes that they're going to be running. So, honestly, I think last week, the game against the Colts, and a little bit even before that when they lost the week before as well, you started to see guys that were just kind of checked out. And you had players that are already kind of looking towards the off season. It's not like they're fighting with each other. It's not like they're angry with each other. There's no situation like what we just saw in the Giants locker room a couple days ago there after their loss, where there was just kind of one of the most ridiculous locker room experiences actually probably I've ever had, with players sounding off every which way. But this is an example here of just players that realize the season's over, they're done, and kind of already have their eyes looking towards the off season. And it's one of those things where, once the game comes and goes, it's like, all right, only 5 weeks left, boys. All right, only 4 weeks left, boys. All right, only 3 weeks left, boys. And you can't fault them for that because the organization's pretty much taken the same approach.
Yeah, it sounds like a lot of disappointment throughout that locker room. And again, joining the show is Conor Hughes, reporter for the Jets and the Giants for Sportsnet New York. And you mentioned just now the Giants locker room was one of the more chaotic ones you've seen. Can you walk me through what that was like?
Yeah, dude, it was just people popping off every which way. I mean, really, I've been doing this since 2014. That's the first time I ever got in an NFL locker room. And occasionally you will have a guy who's very passionate sound off, or you'll have a guy who's very annoyed or angry sound off. But it's usually like a one-off situation where it's one player. And even then it's rare. I remember the year, it must have been 2019, maybe. I think it was 2018, 2019. And it was Jamal Adams who was standing in his locker talking about how we need more dogs. We need more dogs. We don't have enough dogs in this locker room. That's what we need. It's like, wow, okay, that was a player who sounded off. Or, when Zach Wilson said he didn't take any blame for when the Jets struggled. It's like you see very rare situations of it where a player just gets emotional, sounds off, and it's one guy. What was crazy about this Giants locker room is everywhere you turned, some player was sounding off. Whether it was Jermaine Illuminor, their offensive tackle, who was saying guys didn't give 100%. There was Malik Neighbors, who said they were soft as expletive. You had Dexter Lawrence saying they were soft, and then you had Brian Burns saying that he's not sure the coach's message is getting through. I mean, it was just like every which way there were these fires that were just all over the place, and it was just wild. I mean, and that's kind of just an example, man, of the more you do this, you kind of can tell when a coach has a locker room, when a coach doesn't. When things like that start happening, you realize that the players are kind of tuning the coach out, and that's usually a sign that I don't know if there's too many coaches, if there have ever been coaches that come back once they've lost the locker room. That's usually the nail in the coffin. Yeah,
and two more questions I have for you, Connor. Again, going back to what you're saying, where it seems like Dable has officially just lost the locker room. Did you see a path for him returning at all next season? Or even Joe Sheen, for that matter?
Yeah, so I do believe, honestly, man, that they're viewed separately. I don't think that they're this package deal like some people have talked about, where it's like, oh, if you keep Shane, you have to keep Dable. If you keep Dable, you have to keep Shane. I do believe that John Mara, and Mara talked about this actually at the owners' meetings, John Mara did, that he's going to value them and grade them separately, and they are going to be viewed differently, that he's not going to grade it all in a vacuum. So from my understanding is that it's going to be an assessment. I've been told, and this was dating back to earlier in the year, that Shane's seat was less hot than Brian Dable's, that there was more concerns with Dable and more likelihood that Dable would be let go and Shane would be kept. More so because John Mara didn't want to shake up the entire, like we were just talking about with the Jets, he didn't want to shake up the entire viewpoint of the roster. You know what I mean? Like the entire structure of it all. Like you can change coaches with the same general manager, and it's not always like this colossal switch or colossal change because you still have the same scouts in place, you still have the same executives in place, you still have all of those pieces in place that are made towards building a roster. The issue that you have now is that the Giants team seems like they're checked out, which if you want a chance for Dable to return, they're going to have to finish strong. I mean, I genuinely believe. I don't think it's a situation like Jeff Ulbrich where he's 100% gone. I think if Brian Dable can find a way to win, I think they got 6 games left. If he can find a way to go 3-3, if he can find a way to obviously go 4-2 or 3-3 and better, I think there's a chance that he comes back. But if they lose out this year and they finish 2-15, or they only win 1 game when the Eagles are resting their starters here in a couple of weeks, and they finish 3-14, I just don't see any which way the Dable returns. And when you look at the actual structure of the Jets roster, honestly, man, there's not too many reasons to want to think that Shane should come back either, because you're talking about a guy who had potentially the defensive player of the year in Xavier McKinney and the offensive player of the year in Saquon Barkley on his roster.
Yeah.
Like the Giants had them on the roster, let them both walk for free, and now they're having immense success elsewhere. And when you look at his draft history of his 3 drafts, yeah, he hit on Malik Neighbors. Yeah, Wando Robinson's an okay player, but where's the other difference maker? Not Evan Neal. Kayvon Thibodeau has been wildly disappointing in 2 of his 3 seasons. Like, he's a good run stuffer, but where are the difference makers with this draft pick? It's not Deontay Banks. It's not Tyler Newman. It's not Cordell Flott. So there are issues with this roster that extend far beyond the coach. And in my opinion, you're starting to trend to the point here where the Giants could potentially have their worst historical season ever. That they could literally have their worst season they have ever had in their storied franchise. And if that's the case, I just don't know how anybody returns.
Yeah, that's a tough sell right there. Just quick question for you. Next season, do you, or I guess not next season, but for the draft, do you think in all likelihood the Giants will look to draft a QB with their next pick?
I do. I think, honestly, man, it's when they were all in on a quarterback last year. I mean, they were. They wanted, HBO showed. This isn't breaking news. Brian Dable literally said he wanted to trade up for Jaden Daniels. But the Giants also made every effort under the sun to go up with the Patriots to go get Drake May. And what that tells you is that they identified a problem. They identified that Daniel Jones was not the answer and they needed to replace him. And it's very similar to the Jets in the offseason, where they identified a problem with offensive coordinator Nathaniel Hackett. They went out there and made multiple attempts to hire someone that would have basically taken over in full control of the offense. They were unable to do that, but that doesn't erase that problem. The Jets identified a problem. They tried to fix it. They couldn't, but that problem is still there. The Giants identified a problem. They tried to fix it. They couldn't. The problem was still there. What they did in not drafting a quarterback last year and then ultimately cutting Daniel Jones a few days ago here is that they said, okay, this coming year, we're going all in on the quarterback. We're going to get a quarterback. And the ideal hopeful is that they can draft that player organically. But if they're sitting there at 5-6, if they go on a little run here and win a couple games and it drops them in the draft order, I think you'll see whoever the general manager is be very aggressive to get up there to either the number 1 or the number 2 pick, because everything that I've heard talking to multiple scouts, talking to general managers, talking to assistant general managers, talking to people who do this for a living. This isn't my own eyeball test because my eyes don't matter. It's the people who make these decisions are the ones that do. Everything that I've heard is that this quarterback class is not that great. There's Shedeur Sanders, there's Cam Ward, and then there's a pretty substantial drop between the next guy, and there is no consensus pick like last year where it was, Caleb's the clear 1-1, Jaden is very clear 1-2. There really is no consensus top quarterback. In fact, what one assistant general manager told me was that if these 2 quarterbacks, specifically talking about Sanders and Ward, were in the draft last year, they would have fallen somewhere between the 5th or 6th best quarterback in last year's draft. Wow. That tells you how their prospect rankings compared to guys like J.J. McCarthy and guys like Bo Nix and guys like Michael Penix, not even the big 3, that they believe that they fell somewhere after all of those guys. So Unfortunately, it's not a great year to need a quarterback, but for the Giants, they're going to have to take one because they can't delay this another year, especially if Joe Shane comes back, because he won't get another year after this one if he even gets next season.
Yeah, it seems like a tough day to be a fan of any New York football team because the Jets, might be moving off.
At least they got the Knicks.
Yeah,
They got the Knicks.
They got the Knicks, and at least Cat's playing well too, making one trade finally look beneficial for New York.
Yeah.
But Connor, I really appreciate you joining the show, and I hope to stay in touch.
100%, man. No problem at all. I appreciate you having me on.